Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The cold of a Kansas January is a quiet, brittle thing. It seeps into the bones of the houses, settling deep in the wood and glass. On the morning of January 15, 1974, in a small, unassuming home at 803 North Edgemoor Street in Wichita, that cold felt different. It was heavier. A 15-year-old boy named Charlie Otero came home from school with his younger siblings, expecting to find his parents. Instead, he found a silence that was absolute, a stillness that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the phone cord had been cut, and in the master bedroom, a scene of incomprehensible horror was waiting. His father, Joseph, lay on the floor. His mother, Julie, was on the bed. In another room, two of his younger siblings, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were also dead. They had all been bound. They had all been victims of a meticulous, suffocating violence. The architect of this nightmare had left behind a house frozen in time, a family extinguished, and a city on the verge of a terror it could not yet name. The police who arrived that day were walking into the first chapter of a story that would span more than 30 years. They were standing at the epicenter of a mystery that would define a generation of fear in Wichita. The killer had been careful, leaving behind few clues. He was a ghost, a phantom who had slipped into a family's life and erased it. But he had left something else behind, something invisible but potent. A signature. It was a signature of control, of methodical cruelty, and it was just the beginning. Welcome to Anatomy of Crime. In the ecosystem of evil, some predators hunt in the shadows, their existence a dark secret. Others, however, crave the light. They are not content to merely commit the act. They require an audience, an acknowledgement of their dark power. They need a name. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a killer's ego. We explore the case of the BTK Strangler, a man who terrorized a city for decades, not just with his crimes, but with his voice, taunting letters sent to the media and police, creating a legend for himself. We will examine the chilling double life of the man behind the mask, a husband, a father, a church leader who was also a sadistic serial killer. And we will uncover how, after 30 years of silence and fear, it was not a fingerprint or a witness that brought him down, but the very psychological trait that defined his monstrosity, his own unbearable, pathological pride. The initial investigation into the Otero family murders was a frantic search for a motive that simply wasn't there. The home hadn't been ransacked in a way that suggested a typical robbery. Nothing of significant value was missing. Joseph Otero was a retired Air Force mechanic, Julie, a homemaker. They were by all accounts a normal, quiet family. Police were baffled. The crime was too personal for a random break-in, yet too motiveless for a targeted killing. The only real clue left at the scene was a small amount of semen, carefully collected and preserved, a biological long shot in an era before DNA profiling was science fiction. For months, the case went cold. Wichita tried to move on, burying the tragedy under the weight of daily life, hoping it was a singular, inexplicable event. But the killer wasn't finished, and more importantly, he wasn't being recognized. In October of 1974, 9 months after the Otero murders, a public library employee made a strange discovery. Tucked inside a mechanical engineering textbook was a letter. It was addressed to the Wichita Eagle, the city's main newspaper. The letter was a chilling confession, written in crude, blocky letters. It described, in details that had never been made public, exactly what had happened inside the Otero house. The author claimed responsibility, providing information only the killer could know. He wrote about his sexual arousal during the crime and his frustration at being ignored. He wanted credit, and in this letter, he gave himself the name that would become synonymous with fear itself. He wrote, "It's a monster story of a man who got his power from the evil one." He listed possible names for himself: the Wichita Strangler, the Poetic Strangler, the Wichita Hangman, but he suggested one that he clearly preferred, a name that clinically and coldly described his process: bind them. The letter transformed the investigation. The police now knew they were not dealing with a one-time killer. They were hunting a serial predator who was intelligent, organized, and, most terrifyingly, desperate for public recognition. He was playing a game, and the city of Wichita was his unwilling audience. The BTK killer had announced himself to the world. Just 4 months after the Otero murders, even before he had sent his first letter, BTK had already struck again. On April 4, 1974, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Bright was at home with her brother, Kevin. A man forced his way into their apartment, brandishing a pistol. He was looking for a victim, and he had found two. The intruder was methodical. He tied up Kevin, took Catherine into another room, and began to strangle her. But this time, something went wrong for him. Kevin Bright, despite being bound, managed to fight back. He broke free and struggled with the attacker. In the chaos, the intruder shot Kevin twice in the head before stabbing Catherine to death and fleeing the scene. Miraculously, Kevin survived. He was able to give police a description of the attacker: a man of average height and build, with a psychotic look in his eyes. But the description was generic, and the police at the time did not connect this brutal, chaotic attack to the silent, methodical slaughter of the Otero family. They saw it as a robbery gone wrong. They didn't know it was the same monster, one who had been interrupted, his ritual disturbed. He had made a mistake. He had left a survivor. For a killer obsessed with control, this was an unacceptable failure. The revelation in the library letter that fall changed everything. Investigators now had 2 crime scenes to connect. The emerging profile was of a man who stalked his victims, who fantasized about control and domination. He was what criminologists would later call an organized killer. He brought his own kit to the crimes: the ropes, the tape. He planned his attacks. The Otero killings were his ideal scenario: total control, no resistance. The Bright attack was his nightmare, a plan that had spiraled into chaos. After the near disaster at the Bright apartment, BTK went quiet for almost 3 years. Investigators wondered if he was dead or in prison for another crime. The city held its breath, but Dennis Rader was not in prison. He was getting married. He was starting a job at ADT Security Services, a company that installed and maintained home alarm systems. He was building the facade of a perfectly normal life, a life that would become his greatest camouflage. During his day job, he learned the layouts of homes, the habits of their owners, the vulnerabilities of their security. He was a wolf learning how to guard the henhouse. The predator inside him, what he called Factor X, was not gone. It was just waiting. In March of 1977, he chose his next victim, Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3 young children. He cut her phone line and entered her home in the middle of the day. He locked her children in the bathroom, telling them to stay quiet. They could hear their mother's screams from the other room. He bound Shirley Vian, put a plastic bag over her head, and strangled her with a rope. He then calmly left the home, leaving the traumatized children to be discovered later. The crime bore all the hallmarks of the Otero murders: the cut phone line, the binding, The slow, personal method of killing, BTK was back, and his ritual was refined once again. His arrogance grew with each successful murder. He believed he was smarter than the police, a master criminal who could not be caught, and he needed them to know it. Later that year, on December 8, 1977, he broke into the home of 25-year-old Nancy Fox. He strangled her with a pair of pantyhose. The crime scene was again meticulously controlled, but this time he didn't wait to write a letter. Less than an hour after the murder, he drove to a payphone. He dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and a calm male voice on the other end said, "Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing." "Nancy Fox," the dispatcher asked for his name. He paused, then hung up. He had reported his own murder. It was a stunning act of hubris, a direct communication with the authority he was mocking. He was no longer content with letters found by chance in a library. He wanted to hear the shock in their voices, to be a direct participant in the discovery of his own handiwork. He followed up the phone call with another letter, this time sent to a local television station, Cake TV. In it, he took credit for the murders of Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox. He also included a poem, a twisted piece of verse he titled, "Oh, Death to Nancy." It was another glimpse into his psyche, a man who saw himself not just as a killer, but as a dark artist, a poet of death. He was creating his own myth, and he was the only one writing the script. By the end of 1977, BTK was a full-blown media sensation and a terrifying local legend. He had murdered 7 people in 4 separate attacks. The city of Wichita was living in a state of siege. People bought new locks, guard dogs, and guns. No one felt safe because BTK's victims had nothing in common. No shared lifestyle, no connection to each other. They were chosen simply because they were there, because they fit into his violent fantasies. The randomness was the true terror. He could be anyone. He could be anywhere. And then, just as his legend reached its peak, he vanished. The letters stopped. The calls stopped. The killings, as far as anyone knew, stopped. The years ticked by. 1978, 1979, the 1980s dawned. The BTK task force was eventually disbanded. The case files, filled with dead ends and taunting poems, were packed away, growing dusty on shelves. The city of Wichita slowly, cautiously began to heal. The name BTK faded from the headlines, becoming a dark chapter in the city's history, a ghost story parents told to scare their children. Where had he gone? The question haunted investigators and the families of his victims. Had he died, moved away, been incarcerated for some other crime? The truth was far more disturbing. He hadn't gone anywhere. Dennis Rader was still there, living in the Wichita suburb of Park City. He was hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, in plain sight. The 1980s and 1990s were, on the surface, the picture of American suburban life for Dennis Rader. He was a family man. He and his wife had 2 children, a son and a daughter. He was deeply involved in his community. He was a Cub Scout leader, teaching young boys about knots and outdoor skills. He was elected president of the council at his Christ Lutheran Church, a position of respect and authority. He was a compliance officer for Park City, a dog catcher and code enforcer who roamed the neighborhoods in a city vehicle, issuing citations for overgrown lawns or stray animals. He was a familiar, if sometimes annoyingly bureaucratic, face to his neighbors. He was a husband, a father, a public servant. But the predator was not dormant. It was simply evolving. Factor X, his name for the murderous compulsion, still lived within him. He was a hunter who had learned the art of patience. Throughout this long period of public silence, Rader continued to stalk potential victims. He would follow women home from the grocery store, learn their routines, and create detailed plans for their abduction and murder. He called these projects. Most of them, for one reason or another, he never carried through. A car would pull into the driveway at the wrong moment, or a dog would start barking. His meticulous need for control often saved these potential victims. If the circumstances weren't perfect, he would abort the mission. But he did not stop killing. The public and the police just didn't know it. In April 1985, he targeted his next-door neighbor, a 53-year-old woman named Maureen Hedge. He knew her schedule perfectly. He snuck into her home one night, abducted her, and took her to his church, where he was the president. In the sanctity of the church building, he photographed her in bondage poses and then strangled her. He dumped her body in a remote ditch. When her body was found days later, police treated it as a standalone murder. It didn't fit the BTK pattern of the 1970s. The victim was older, and she was abducted from her home. Not killed inside it, the connection was missed. A year later, in September 1986, he struck again. He broke into the home of Vicki Wagerly, a 28-year-old mother. He killed her in much the same way he had Nancy Fox. He then took a Polaroid picture of her body. After this murder, he once again made a phone call, this time to the victim's husband, Bill Wagerly. When Bill answered, Rader said nothing. He just breathed heavily into the phone for a few moments, a silent, terrifying announcement of his presence before hanging up. Like the Hedge case, Wagerly's murder was not publicly linked to BTK. The signature was there, but the taunting public letters were not. Without his self-aggrandizing communications, investigators treated it as another unsolved homicide. His final known victim was Dolores Davis in January 1991. She was 62 years old. He stalked her, broke into her home using a key he had stolen, and waited for her to return. He abducted her, took her to a remote location under a bridge, murdered her, and left her body there. Once again, without a letter from BTK claiming responsibility, the police did not make the connection. For 13 years after the murder of Dolores Davis, there was silence. No more killings that could be attributed to him. No more letters. The city, and even the original investigators, had largely accepted that the BTK saga was over. The monster had simply disappeared, but Dennis Rader was still there. He was raising his children, going to church, and writing tickets for zoning violations. He kept trophies from his crimes hidden in his home, driver's licenses, jewelry, and his chillingly detailed journals and drawings, which he called the BTK story. He was living with his secrets, curating his own dark legacy in private. But for a narcissist like Rader, a private legacy is no legacy at all. He had created a famous villain, a household name. And as the years went by, he saw that name being forgotten. New monsters had captured the public imagination. The BTK killer was becoming a footnote, and for Dennis Rader, that was an insult he could not endure. In March of 2004, the Wichita Eagle ran a story marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murders. The article recounted the terror of the BTK era and lamented that the killer was never caught. It essentially wrote his obituary as a criminal legend. For Dennis Rader, reading this article was like a gauntlet being thrown down. He had been forgotten. His life's work was being relegated to a cold case file. His ego, the driving force behind his need to communicate, could not let this stand. He decided it was time to remind Wichita and the world who he was. He sent a package to the Wichita Eagle. Inside was a letter, a copy of Vicky Wagerly's driver's license, which he had stolen in 1986, and the Polaroid photograph he had taken of her body. The message was clear and terrifying. "I am still here, and this murder you never attributed to me, it was mine." The package sent a shockwave through the Wichita Police Department and the community. BTK was back. This re-emergence began one of the most unique and bizarre chapters in the history of criminal investigation. It was a cat-and-mouse game, played out in public, between a 21st century police force and a killer whose methods and mindset were frozen in the 1970s. Leading the renewed investigation was Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, a homicide detective who had been a young officer when the BTK crimes first began. The case had haunted him his entire career. Now he had a second chance. Landwehr and his team knew they had one major advantage: technology. The semen sample from the Otero crime scene, preserved for 3 decades, could now yield a full DNA profile. They also had DNA from under Vicky Wagerly's fingernails. They had the killer's genetic blueprint. The problem was, they had nothing to compare it to. He wasn't in any criminal database. They would need a suspect to get a match. Their best hope was to keep the killer talking. Rader, starved for attention after years of silence, was more than happy to oblige. He began a series of communications, a bizarre correspondence with the media and the police. He sent a letter to a local television station, Cake, containing a word puzzle. He left a package in a box of Post Toasties cereal on the side of a road, instructing the police where to find it. Inside were more items, including a letter that asked a chilling question: "Can I communicate with WPD and not be traced?" He was testing them. He was trying to understand the limits of modern technology. He also sent them a detailed chapter list for the book he was supposedly writing about his life. The BTK story. It listed all his known murders and hinted at others. His communications were a mix of taunting, bragging, and a strange desire for understanding. He seemed to view Lieutenant Landwehr not as an adversary, but as a peer who could appreciate his genius. The police played a careful game. They used the media to communicate back to him. They set up a special P.O. box. They answered his questions indirectly through news reports. They had to stroke his ego, to make him feel safe and in control, all while hoping he would make a mistake. Rader became bolder. He sent a package containing a Barbie doll, bound and gagged in a way that mimicked his murder of the young Josephine Otero. It was a grotesque and heartless trophy, another demonstration of his power over his victims, even decades after their deaths. The investigation was a slow, painstaking process. They re-examined every old tip, every potential suspect from the 1970s. They built a new psychological profile, one that suggested BTK was likely in his 50s or 60s, a man who felt he was losing his relevance and wanted to reclaim his legacy before he died. He was, they reasoned, a narcissist of the highest order, and they knew that a narcissist's greatest weakness is their own sense of superiority. They just needed to find a way to exploit it. The breakthrough came from a place Rader himself suggested. In a package sent in January of 2005, he included another letter. In it, he posed a question that would seal his fate. He asked the police if he sent them a floppy disk, would they be able to trace it back to him? He wanted to know if the technology was as good as he'd heard. He proposed a deal. If they couldn't trace it, they should place a personal ad in the newspaper with the message, "Rex, it will be okay." Landwehr and his team saw their opening. They knew that telling him the truth, that a floppy disk could absolutely be traced, would scare him off. Telling him a lie might be too risky if he had some technical knowledge. So, they chose the path of deliberate omission. They placed the ad in the paper. "Rex, it will be okay." It was a calculated risk, a gamble on their suspect's monumental ego. They were betting that he would believe them, that his desire to share his story would overwhelm his caution. The gamble paid off. On February 16, 2005, a padded envelope arrived at the KSAS-TV station. Inside was a purple, 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk. The label on the disk contained a note to the news station instructing them to insert the disk into a computer. "If you are the only one that gets this," it read, "it is a big story." The police's computer forensics unit took the disk. They opened the file, a Microsoft Word document. It was another taunting letter from BTK. But the real prize wasn't in the words on the screen. It was in the digital dust, the hidden information stored within the file's metadata. The forensic analyst looked at the document's properties. The metadata showed that the file had last been modified by a user named Dennis, and it identified the location where the document had been saved, Christ Lutheran Church. It was a thunderbolt. For the first time in 31 years, they had a name and a location. Detectives immediately pulled the records for Christ Lutheran Church. They ran a search for anyone named Dennis associated with the church. The result came back almost instantly. The president of the church council was a man named Dennis Rader. Suddenly, all the pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place. They pulled Dennis Rader's file. He had been in the Air Force, just like Joseph Otero. He worked for ADT Security Services from 1974 to 1988, the exact period of the first wave of BTK murders, giving him expert knowledge of home security systems. He now worked as a compliance officer for Park City, which gave him a vehicle and a plausible reason to be cruising neighborhoods, observing homes. He fit the age profile. He lived in the area. It was all there. He was the plain sight monster. But they still needed definitive proof. They needed his DNA. Putting Rader under surveillance, they followed him, hoping to collect a discarded cigarette or coffee cup. But Rader was careful. He didn't offer any easy opportunities. The investigators knew they couldn't risk approaching him directly and spooking him. They needed a way to get his DNA without his knowledge. They discovered that Rader's daughter, Carrie, was a student at Kansas State University and had recently had a routine medical exam at the university clinic. In a move that was legally complex but critically necessary, investigators obtained a warrant for the pap smear sample that was on file from that exam. The sample was sent to the lab to be tested against the DNA profile recovered from under Vicky Wagerly's fingernails. The technicians worked to establish a familial DNA link, a match between the daughter's DNA and the DNA of the unknown killer. The results came back. It was a match. The DNA from the crime scene belonged to the father of the woman who had unknowingly provided the final, conclusive piece of evidence. They had him. After 31 years, 1 month, and 10 days, the ghost who called himself BTK finally had a real name, Dennis Rader. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was driving home from his lunch break. He saw several police cars lining the street near his house. As a compliance officer, he assumed they were there for some other purpose, perhaps to assist him. He pulled over. An officer approached his window. And just like that, in the middle of a normal weekday afternoon, the reign of Wichita's most feared predator came to a quiet, almost anticlimactic end. There was no chase, no shootout, no dramatic confrontation. The man who had terrorized a city for 3 decades was arrested without incident. At the station, Rader was placed in an interrogation room with Lieutenant Landwehr. At first, he was calm, even a little smug. He denied everything. For over an hour, he played the part of the confused, wrongly accused civil servant. Landwehr let him talk. Then he laid out the evidence. He told him about the floppy disk. He told him about Christ Lutheran Church. And then he told him about the DNA. He looked at Rader and said, "We have your DNA. It's a match." The mask shattered. Rader's demeanor changed completely. The smug denial evaporated, replaced by a chilling, detached acceptance. He leaned forward and asked for a piece of paper. He drew a line down the middle. On one side he wrote BTK. On the other, he wrote Dennis Rader. He looked at the detectives and calmly said, "I'm the one you're looking for." What followed was one of the most remarkable confessions in the annals of crime. For more than 30 hours, Dennis Rader talked, and talked, and talked. It was not a confession born of guilt or remorse. It was a lecture. He spoke without emotion, like a professor detailing a research project. He referred to his victims as projects that he had put down. He corrected detectives on minor details of the crime scenes, annoyed that their files were incomplete or inaccurate. He described his motivations, his fantasies, his methods with an unnerving clinical precision. He explained his double life, how he could be a loving father one moment and a cold-blooded killer the next. He saw no contradiction. Dennis Rader went to church. BTK did not. Dennis Rader loved his family. BTK did not. He had compartmentalized his life so completely that he could speak of the most horrific acts with the same detached tone one might use to describe fixing a leaky faucet. He explained that Factor X, the demonic force he claimed drove him, had been with him since he was a child. He confessed to all the known BTK killings and confirmed that the Hedge, Wagerly, and Davis murders were also his. He was not confessing to clear his conscience. He was dictating his autobiography to the only audience he now had. He believed he was teaching the police, finally showing them how brilliant he had been, how he had outsmarted them for so long. He was performing. The interrogation room was his final stage, and this confession was his magnum opus. The 30 years of silence had been a dam holding back a flood of narcissistic pride, and now it had finally burst. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, he delivered a 40-minute monologue, a rambling, bizarre speech in which he described his crimes in cold, graphic detail, showing no emotion except for a flicker of pride in his own cruel efficiency. The victims' families were forced to listen as he recounted their loved ones' final terrified moments. It was his last cruel act of control. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a mandatory minimum of 175 years in prison, the maximum allowed in Kansas at the time of his crimes. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he remains in solitary confinement, a legend only in his own mind. The case of the BTK killer is a study in the anatomy of pathological narcissism. Dennis Rader was not a brilliant criminal mastermind. He was a meticulous planner who benefited from the limited forensic technology of his time. He was, in the end, an average man with a monstrous secret. What made him unique was his insatiable hunger for recognition. It was the engine of his crimes, and, ultimately, the instrument of his downfall. For 3 decades, he successfully maintained the mask of normalcy, a feat of psychological compartmentalization that is as terrifying as his murders. He was the church president who used the sanctuary to plan his next kill. He was the security expert who used his knowledge to terrify a city. But he could not bear to be forgotten. He could not stand the thought of his dark legacy fading into obscurity. The police didn't truly find him. He led them to his door. He believed he was playing a game of chess with them. But in reality, he was playing against himself. His pride demanded an audience. His ego demanded a legacy. And in reaching for that perverse form of immortality, he handed them the key. He was a predator consumed by his own reflection. Evil is not always the stranger in the shadows. Sometimes it is the man next door, the one who waves to you as he collects the morning paper, the one whose banality is the most terrifying mask of all. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.